best in radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome, and you are listening to the Financial Survival Network. It's Kerry Lutz, and back from a very short vacation, refreshed, recharged. And with us now is Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow and Director for the Center on Peace and Liberty. And, well, got to talk about what's happening with this Khorasan group. Do they really exist? And the justification for bombing Syria and Iraq and ISIS. Ivan, welcome back.
Thanks, Kerry.
Hey,
glad to be back.
Hey, so this whole thing is just you wonder whether this Khorasan group really exists, and the justification for bombing. They're using they're dusting off the UN resolution and self-defense. And what's your take on all this?
Well, I think that they're trying to justify by using this Khorasan group, very little known group, is that they're trying to find a self-defense rationale for attacking Syria, which is, of course, is a sovereign nation. There's no UN security resolution. Syria has not invited the United States to do so. So the only other rationale under international law is self-defense. That would be the same thing under the U.S. Constitution for acting without congressional approval. The only way you can do it is if there's a self-defense of an imminent attack. So at least that's what the original founding idea was at the time of the Constitution, writing the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention. So that would this imminent attack would satisfy both the U.S. requirement and the international law requirement. However, their justification is shaky because there really is no imminent attack. The White House officials said there was an imminent attack, but then, of course, intelligence officials, which don't like to be held to fictional things, they were saying, without directly contradicting the White House, they were saying, this group didn't have a target, a time, or a place, or a method of attacking, and therefore we can only conclude, and this is my conclusion, that there is no imminent attack since none of those things were fulfilled on the group's part. So it's a very shaky concept that this is self-defense, and that's one reason I think they're bringing up this Khorasan group.
And some people even doubt whether this Khorasan group really exists or not.
Yeah, I really can't speak to that, but they're saying that they're an offshoot of Al Qaeda, but yet they still get along with Al Qaeda, whereas ISIS is an offshoot of Al Qaeda and it doesn't get along with it. So, of course, Al Qaeda has always been more of a threat to the U.S. than ISIS because it has agents in the West and more advanced bomb making than ISIS does. But ISIS, of course, is more of more than a terrorist group. It has tanks, artillery, etc., and infrastructure. Of course, that's a good thing if you're trying to attack it to start with. But eventually, this ISIS group is going to go to ground, meaning going back into the cities and hiding among the people. And their leaders are already doing that, of course. And so eventually, you're going to have to fight a counterinsurgency. I wrote a book last year, The Failure of Counterinsurgency, which discusses all the perils of counterinsurgency warfare against guerrillas and terrorists. And so I think the U.S. has to be very careful because in these types of counterinsurgency wars, you always need a force on the ground. And unfortunately, the U.S. really doesn't have local forces. The Free Syrian Army is in shambles because Assad has been singling that out. And also the Kurdish Peshmerga and the Iraqi forces, of course, didn't do very well against ISIS. So you don't have many local forces. Now, regional forces, Turkey has a huge army that could help out. But, of course, Biden has been telling them that they caused the problem. And, of course, he's telling the truth. That's right. But whether you should say it to them when you're trying to get them to help you out with bases sending their own troops. So I think the answer to this problem is twofold. First is you're going to have to recruit local or regional forces like Turkey to go in there and be the ground forces. And second of all, we have to ask if these airstrikes aren't being more counterproductive, because they're certainly giving ISIS followers and more money, and they may just be, they're certainly attacking some targets, but the question is, are you creating more fighters than you're killing? And the other problem with this whole campaign is that now that we're attacking ISIS, we've left Assad free to attack the Free Syrian Army, and of course he wants to eliminate that group. But of course we're trying to rely on that group in the long term to be our ground force in Syria. But he wants to attack it, get rid of it, because he's figuring we're going to attack his other opponent, ISIS, while he's finishing off our opponent, or the one that we're supporting. And so, we may be left with nothing to oppose Assad in Syria, and so that would contradict the claim that we're still trying to take out Assad. So the whole policy is messed up from the get-go, and it's very unlikely that they can decimate ISIS, and if so, it's going to take probably 10 years to do so.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like there's much of a consensus on what to do with them, and it's just a whole mess, and they're thriving on the disunity and the chaos.
Yeah, and if you're trying to help the Free Syrian Army group, Assad has intensified his attacks against them while we're hitting ISIS. So that's counterproductive. The other thing that's counterproductive is if your goal is to take out Assad, you're helping his enemy. You're helping him get rid of his enemy, ISIS. So that, Obama says, well, that's not going to help Assad. Well, can't help but help Assad. So the question is, you help one side and the other side gains, that the other side that has human rights abuses gains, and vice versa. So it's a real mess, because we'd like everybody in Syria to go away, I think, but unfortunately they're all there and they're all fighting each other, and it's just a mess. And the United States really should shy away from putting ground combat forces in, but I'm afraid, there is a chance that we're going to get pulled into this, as much as the public hates that idea, simply because the airstrikes are not working. They're working to some extent, but they're not going to. ISIS is still advancing in some places. And also, you do have to have a force on the ground. Well, we don't have local forces, and we don't have a very good regional force that's willing to go in there if Turkey's not really willing to go in there. So then who's left? Well, the United States always ends up having to do these things. And frankly, in every region of the world, we care more about the country's security in that region than they do. And so Turkey should be leaping to correct its mistake, get rid of ISIS, et cetera. But of course, Turkey is also, I think, more threatened by Shiite militias, because they're backed by a very strong country, Iran, than they are about ISIS, which is a Sunni group. And they're Sunnis. Of course, they don't like ISIS very much because they're too radical, but they feel that they're a backstop against the Shiite militias. So if you get rid of ISIS, the Shiite militias will probably be dominant, and they're backed by Iran. So there's really no way you can win in this situation. And so I think the U.S. should probably just stay out of the whole thing.
Yeah, well, I guess we're past the point of staying out, minding our own business, though, aren't we?
Well, of course that's true, but of course you could say, well, we bombed them, we contained them, and good luck to the regional forces. You could do that. You could declare victory and go home, and that's always an option. Of course, Obama might take some flack about that at home from McCain and all the other hawks, but that's probably the best option he's got.
Yeah. Well, how likely are they to exercise that option, though?
Well, probably not, because governments don't turn on a dime like that. But of course, if we had done that in Vietnam, we would have avoided the quagmire. If we would have done it in Iraq, we would have, all these places, if you would have limited your losses and gone home. But it's very difficult for countries to do that, because they get their prestige on the line. And that's the danger of getting a toe in the water with these airstrikes and maybe a few advisors on the ground. because your prestige has been attached to it. And if the first increment doesn't work, that is the airstrikes, then people go, well, okay, what are we going to do now? How are we going to escalate? And we got to get these guys and stuff. So, Obama, unfortunately, is already on record saying he's going to destroy or decimate the group instead of saying, well, we need our allies in the region to do this.
Yeah, and they aren't exactly jumping at the opportunity. And you have to wonder what's going to happen next.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next.
This show is brought to you by Audible, your leading source for audiobooks and courses. You know that I'm a huge Audible fan. I've got over 300 audiobooks in my library and have been a member for over 6 years. They've got a great deal for you. Join now and get a 30-day free membership and a free book. Go to audiblepodcast.com/FSN. That's audiblepodcast.com/FSN. I just downloaded Lee Child's latest in his Jack Reacher series. I can't wait till my drive to South Carolina to start listening to it. I know you'll love Audible as much as I do. Go to audiblepodcast.com/FSN and get started today.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Well, all these countries, and this happened during the Cold War too, all these smaller countries, they know that prestige arguments are very important for empires and superpowers, because if their prestige if there's a ding in it one place, other people will try to put a ding in it somewhere else. And they know that the superpower is very sensitive to this. So, of course, they play on that and say, well, this is your fight, too. You need to come and help us. And, of course, the U.S. always rushes in. And instead of laying back and saying, well, we'll help you if you really get in trouble, but, it's your show. And that we never do that. We always dive in, and we always regret it. But we keep doing the same things over and over again, even though they don't work. I mean, where have our military interventions really done anything positive? Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, they're all going straight down the tubes. And then you've got Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, which have all been destabilized by U.S. attacks. So, this is Syria is the seventh Islamic attack, country that we've attacked or invaded. And, each time our leaders, whether it's Bush or Obama, we always say, well, we're not at war with Islam. Here are reasons for doing this. But, we've piled up 7 countries, and they're all Islamic. People in the Islamic world begin to say, well, they say it's not a war on Islam, but boy, it sure does look like it to us. And, of course, this leads to worldwide more Islamic radicalism and more anti-U.S. terrorism. And I think we've got to quit doing this.
Yeah. Well, so is it a war on Islam, or isn't it? Or is it a war on fanatical Islamists? What exactly is it here, Ivan?
Well, I'm not sure that we know. I mean, we tend to, just like in the communist era, a communist was a communist until a communist wasn't a communist. When Tito and Yugoslavia broke off from the Soviet Union, the Chinese broke off from the Soviet Union, we started to get more sophisticated as the Cold War went along and saying, hey, maybe we can drive a wedge between some of these groups. Well, I think we need to do that in this case. We need to focus which of these groups are attacking the U.S. They're all Islamic radicals, but which ones are attacking the U.S. and which ones aren't? Let's focus our efforts. If we have to take military action, let's do it as a last resort. Let's do it in the shadows. If you're fighting terrorism in the open with an open warfare, you're losing the battle because you're creating more terrorists than you're killing, and that's what we're doing. ISIS is no threat to the U.S. If you want to focus on the Khorasan group, fine, main Al-Qaeda, whatever, but these are very small groups compared to ISIS. But we're not, for instance, we're not bombing Boko Haram in Nigeria. Every bit as brutal as ISIS. They're not getting much press at all. And that's a good thing, I think. But I think we also need to focus on which groups are attacking us and which are not. One Islamic radical is not necessarily another one, especially when most of them are concerned with local issues, including many of the Al-Qaeda affiliates. And I think we haven't really distinguished between those. We've gone into Yemen after Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. We've gone off to the Pakistani Taliban. We've gone after the Shabab, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia. But a lot of these groups, they wouldn't attack us if the United States hadn't been there in the first place. So we need to stop shooting ourselves in the foot, I think.
Yeah, well, we seem to have a knack for doing that, though, don't we?
Yeah, but I mean, the politicians can, with a straight face, can say, oh, well, now we need to bomb Iraq and Syria after all the catastrophes that we've had in the last decade and a half. I mean, it's just mind-boggling that the public puts up with this stuff,
Yeah, well, when was the last time they listened to the public about anything?
Yeah, well, I think in the long term you have to, but you're right. In the short term, it's the people, the politicians think they can get away with a lot. But if you're going to run a war in the long term, Iraq and Afghanistan both went south, and public opinion went fairly quickly, and they did ignore it. They can ignore public opinion longer than they used to be able to because there's no draft. If you have a draft, of course, then you have middle-class families getting their kids who want to be doctors, lawyers, scientists, whatever, getting killed in some foreign war. People don't like that very much, and the volunteer army allows you to get into more mischief. But even then, when you have to start deploying National Guard units and that sort of stuff, eventually the war wears out its welcome even at home. But you're right, the leash is a bit longer nowadays than it used to be. So that's unfortunate. I think, although I'm not a supporter of the draft, I think that we need to find a way to put more forces in our National Guard and less in the regular Army and Marines, so that we have to mobilize these citizen soldiers, and maybe that will be a break to this types of activities.
Yeah, and perhaps a real national debate about these things rather than these scripted and really just it's a fait accompli by the time it gets to the public's perception, right?
Well, that's why I also think, we have a Congress that has abdicated its responsibilities. It's been an executive aggrandizement of the war power ever since Truman didn't declare war in Korea. But it's also been the Congress being chicken. This was an election year. They did not want to vote on it before the election because votes on war are dangerous for politicians because they can end up on the wrong side of a very searing issue. So what do? They'll probably vote on it when they get back, maybe if we're lucky. But, then, as you mentioned, it's a fait accompli. We've got to stop letting the executive commit the country to war. And then, of course, the only way that the Congress can stop the war is cut off the funds to the troops in the field. And, of course, Congress, people of both parties, they're very leery of doing that because they're going to be called unpatriotic or whatever. So you have to stop the thing before it starts. But it's very difficult when Congress doesn't declare war anymore, that the executive just marches off and starts bombing or attacking countries without congressional approval, which is totally against what the founders had intended at the Constitutional Convention. I mean, there are many gray areas of the Constitution, but that's not one of them. The debate at the Constitutional Convention was very clear. Congress should declare war or even approve minor military actions, except in the case of an imminent attack against the United States. And even then, Congress, at the first opportunity when it reconvenes, should approve what the president has done if he has taken steps for imminent defense against an imminent attack. So the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention are fairly clear on this point. And, of course, we've gotten way away from it, and we're in very unconstitutional territory with all of this nowadays.
Yeah, and, if there's ever a case of the wisdom of the founding fathers, we've discovered it over and over at our cost, at our expense, haven't we?
Right.
Yeah. So going back to a little bit of constitutionalism in this case wouldn't be such a bad thing, would it?
No, I mean, I think, that's the one area. Some politicians realize this, but it's, we always concentrate on the deaths in war, principally about Americans, because we don't really pay too much attention to foreigners that die, but we pay attention to the casualties and the monetary costs. But the real cost, one of the biggest costs of these wars, and one that people don't pay enough attention to, is the erosion of the republic itself and the constitutional system. And it's been severely eroded in the congressional war power. And we just saw how chicken the Congress was to undertake what is supposed to be it's probably its most important congressional function. The way the founders set it up is to approve military action by the country.
And we see what happens when there's no real consensus behind it. It almost inevitably ends in failure and great cost to the country, and really nothing gets accomplished, and just awful things happen as a result. So
the executive just keeps getting more powerful, not only in this realm, but the wars make the executive power more powerful even in the domestic area. Wars tend to concentrate power in the executive branch, and so, of course, it throws off the original conception where the Congress was supposed to be the dominant branch of government, and the president was merely supposed to execute and enforce the law in a narrow role for the executive, and a narrow role as commander-in-chief of the armies in the field. Of course, we've gotten way away from that, with the president using the commander-in-chief to, detain people without trial, torture people, blah, 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 right? And then we also have the case of, where the executive power is really gone to such an extent that we have an imperial presidency. I mean, the founders would just roll over in their graves if they knew that the president was allowed to take the country to war without some sort of congressional approval, even minor uses of military power, because, of course, the founders were reacting to the monarchs of old in Europe who took their countries to war on a whim, and, of course, all the costs fell on the common citizen in blood and treasure, and they wanted to avoid that. So that's why we have the Congressional Declaration of War requirement in the Constitution, and as I mentioned before, that's not followed and hasn't been followed since Truman.
Yep, and even a minor impingement like the War Powers Act really has proven totally ineffective in reining in the executive's power, and it looks like expansion of the imperial president. There's basically nothing there that can stop it. The judiciary doesn't want to stop it, and the Congress doesn't want to stop it. So what's going to stop it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, the War Powers Act was written after Vietnam, and everybody was wanting to stop the president from doing this. But, of course, if the Congress doesn't enforce that act, and the ultimate power that the Congress has is to cut off funding, but the executive branch scares Congress by saying, well, just go ahead and cut the funds off to forces in the field. We can't buy them bullets, we can't buy them blankets, we can't buy them boots, can't buy them helmets, body armor, etc. That the congressmen run for the hills. But if they did that once, just flex their muscles and say, listen, we're going to cut this war off right now, and we're going to lose more people by keeping the war going than by cutting off the funding and saying, let's get out of there. But the Congress doesn't have that courage to do that, because I think there's a flaw in the system, in that the founders thought that the various branches, the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the president would all stick up for their prerogatives as institutions. But unfortunately, in Congress, the people stick up for the members, individual members, that is, themselves, rather than the institution. And that's what they just did when they fled Washington without voting, because if they were sticking up for the institution, they would say, yes, we do need to vote, and we need to vote before the election, and we need to vote before the president confronts us with a fait accompli. But, of course, they didn't, because they're more concerned about themselves getting reelected. So the incentives there are sort of bad for things working out the way they should.
Yeah, unfortunately so. Well, Ivan, just tell us where we find your work and how we follow you on the internet.
Well, my book on counterinsurgency is called The Failure of Counterinsurgency, Why Hearts and Minds Are Seldom Won. It's published by ABC Clio. and you can get that on Amazon. And I also have a new book out by Revised Recarving Rushmore, which ranks the presidents on peace, prosperity, and liberty. And many of these ideas are in individual biographies of presidents that are in the book. And you can also get that at Amazon or from the Independent Institute where I work. And the website address for that is www.independent.org.
All right. Excellent. And of course, you'll find the links on the financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter. As always, Ivan, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kerry. Bye.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.